Mastin, brother, welcome to the Alchemy Podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm super excited. It's my first in-person podcast in a long time, so I'm very excited.
Yeah, I think during COVID, especially doing a lot of podcasts, we get used to the Zoom.
Totally.
But I'm probably like you, man. I love the in-person.
Yes.
I've seen that in the in-person convo. It's a totally different conversation.
Yeah, there's another just like square right here.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, can you hear me?
Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to say off the get-go, one thing I really admire about you is you are like all in, send it when it comes to personal development and spirituality and healing. And I find myself on my own, like, for example, Instagram, I'll be going through friends' Instagrams who don't know you, and they're like reposting your stuff.
Oh, no way. That's
all
awesome.
the time. And
I wish my friends would do that.
Yeah, right. Same. And so your like level of influence is like spreading like crazy. And one thing that, at least in my experience, is people who have committed themselves so deeply to a cause usually has come from their own personal struggle.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm curious, because I don't know this about you. I'm curious, who was Mastin before you kind of broke into this massive level of influence and healing and really committing your life to bettering people's lives? Like, what was your journey? And like, was there a specific moment where you're like, I need to make some changes?
I feel like I've had so many of those moments. So I'll give you a little like clue on self-help people or therapy people or spiritual people, like people who are in like kind of this genre. Whatever the name of their book or program is, they struggle with the opposite of that name. So reclaim your nervous system. So it wasn't mine. It was like out there in the world, right? Or like be here now. Probably had a hard time being present, or like the body keeps the score. Like Bessel's like very cognitive in his head. So whatever we are teaching, we struggle with also. And I feel like that's like maybe like an open secret, but like none of us have it figured out. And we're all just kind of making it up as we go along, doing the best that we can.
Yeah.
So just so we're very clear about that. Like I do not have it figured out. Like I'm still just kind of like strategically making strategic guesses the entire time. And if you look at every scientific paper ever written, at the end of it says more research is needed. So nobody knows what they're doing. We're just trying to do it better and better and better. Just so we're really like put a disclaimer. For me, there's been multiple choice points in my life, and I have this like metric in my mind, and it came from a specific moment. And the metric is this: there's door A and there's door B, and door A is like the default door, and door B is like the harder door, and it's harder now. But if you are looking back on your deathbed, which choice would you like to have made from this moment? So you're future pacing yourself, and that came from I had the privilege and the honor to be in the room, in an emergency room or ICU room, with one of my best friend. I was watching his father pass. He had a form of cancer, and it was pretty clear that this is the moment. So it was me and the family, and that's it in this room. And I was just like, what am I watching? Like my consciousness kind of floated out of my body. I think it checked out and dissociated. But then I was like, take this in, Mastin. I think I was in the mid-20s. And I watched this body transition from a being to a shell. And there's this moment, I'd never been that close to death before. We sort of do not talk about or keep ourselves close to death in the West, in the American culture. In other cultures, Indian culture, Balinese culture, other cultures, there's a celebration of it. It's very close. But here it's like very anesthetized and clean and all this stuff and far. And so I was just sitting there like, wait a minute, that was a being and now it's a shell. And there was just like deep knowing that one day, Mastin, that's going to be you, like for real, like not like a quote card, not like a book I read or even a breakthrough in a seminar. It was just a cellular level. Like it was a gift. That moment was a gift. And that's why I got this tattoo on my arm. This too will pass. And then the second tattoo is trust, because my anxiety saw that and said, this too will pass. What if it gets worse? I had to put trust. This is actually 2 tattoos. But in that moment, I was like, I'm going to be in this situation one day. So when I'm in this situation, meaning I'm about to cross over or pass, or this life will end for me, how do I want to look at the choices I made? And that was the moment where I really understood that like this life is so finite. And at that point, I think that really was the rocket fuel for so much courage that had to come to do all the things that I'm doing. Because I was sort of living life on the sidelines at that point. And because I knew that I won't always be here, I don't really have much to lose. Because the thing I'm most afraid of is dying. That's what we're all most afraid of. So why would I not live if I'm afraid of dying? It seems like opposite. And so that's on like a cellular level. So whenever I hit a choice point in my life from that moment forward, I think to myself, okay, I'm kind of defaulting over here, which is like door A, kind of like the easy, natural response. Okay, but like door B, it's like if I'm on my deathbed and I go back to that moment, I put myself in that position where I'm the one passing. I'm like, okay, let's go through door B. And it's always harder and it always works out. It's always terrifying. And I was talking to my friend Tucker Max the other day, and he was reflecting because he read the book, and he also helped me make this book. And he was like, bro, you chose the hardest path possible to get where you are. There's so many easier paths. You chose the hardest one, like respect, but like, what the hell? And I was like, well, door A, door B. And he understood, but it was just this feeling that I have. And it's like insanity or intuition. I can't tell the difference sometimes, but it's just felt sense of like, if I'm going to not be here one day and I reflect on this moment, how will I wanted to have chosen? And I don't want to be the guy that's like, oh, I wish I would have done this.
Right.
I don't want to be that guy because I understand this life is temporary. So I'm not sure if that's inspiring or morbid, but that was the moment, you know?
Yeah. And I think, one thing it can be that morbid in that capacity. And one thing that's clear for me is people who decide to make a change, I think we grossly underestimate how much courage it takes to make a shift.
Yes.
Right. To make a shift. So what, in your specific life, what were some of those courageous moments where you're like, you know what, I'm stuck in pattern A, door A, it's not working. I have to make this like grueling, courageous, fearful, scary decision to make some changes in my life.
So first, let me give you my mindset on courage, and then I'll answer the specific question. So my mindset on courage is that it's rent. And what I mean by that is you pay it daily. So yesterday's courage does not accrue. There's no interest. There's no compounding interest on your courage. Because if we're going to grow, if we're ambitious, then we're always going to be asking ourselves to make a courageous choice. And so if you were courageous today, that's today's rent. But tomorrow, it's a different type of courage. And so I think people, especially people who become successful early on, I saw this a lot in the music business as a manager, people who were successful early on kind of got pigeonholed into a certain thing. And the artists who would transcend were the ones who would always continue to take risks and not like be like, well, I'm going to be pigeonholed in this kind of way. Same thing with musicians, actors, entertainers in general. They have to keep risking into the unknown. And so we can't live based on our past courageous choices. We have to continue to make these choices. So I do this on almost a daily basis, whether it's deciding to start my blog many years ago, The Daily Love, and go, I guess someone might want to read this. I'm not too sure. And then just publishing. Whether it was responding to an email that we got once from Harpo.com, which was Oprah's company, that took courage. That was actually really scary. When she invited me on Super Soul Sunday, I was like, this is a joke. Like
that's insane. That's like,
I'm like in my 20s, like I don't belong here.
Yeah.
I do not like, it's very like she's made a mistake. She's very smart, but with me, she's definitely made a mistake on this one. Like, what are you thinking? And I almost didn't get on the plane. My friend Gabby Bernstein was in LA with me, and thank God she was there. She kind of helped me get on the plane, but I literally almost didn't get on the plane. So I feel like I'm constantly doing things like this. And it's usually to like the stuff that on the outside seems easy. Like, of course I'd want that. I remember the first time we had like $100,000 month, like it took courage to like not turn myself into the FBI. I felt illegal or something like that. Like the first time I led a retreat, and even every time I go on stage, there's always courage. There's always a little bit of stage fright. There's always a little bit of something. So if I'm not exercising that muscle, I feel scared, which is weird because I'm also feeling scared if I'm being courageous, but it's a different type of fear. There's a fear that creates positive momentum, and there's a fear that creates stuckness. And the fear that creates stuckness, I try to stay away from. But there's been so many choices along the way where it was like, okay, well, maybe I'll just start coaching people, or that first invoice, to send that first invoice. Or like the first time I made a $25,000 offer, I talked so fast, nobody knew what I was selling, but I had such enthusiasm that they went to the back of the room and half the people bought this retreat. I was just like, okay, interesting. Like, that's fascinating. And we'd already delivered so much value ahead of time. So I feel like especially as entrepreneurs, we're like gladiators, and like the longer we play, the more likely we are to die. So we have to like keep it going.
Yeah, it seems like you were really battling, something as a coach as well. Conversations I have all the time is this imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Right. And you said something I want to just distinguish a little bit. You said, we can deal with kind of imposter syndrome from fear, or it could be kind of from this growth phase. How do you kind of distinguish the difference between those two fears, right?
Yeah. What specifically with imposter syndrome, you got to have a real conversation with yourself. Like, let's pretend for a second, like, so I'm a coach, right? I have no degrees, I have no licenses, right? So if I'm like, I'm a therapist, and then I'm like, no, I have imposter syndrome. Well, no, you're not enough to be a therapist.
Right.
So like, let's check yourself. The other thing about imposter syndrome is some people will be like, well, I'm not enough to make this business get to 6 or 7 figures. It's like, well, that's true because nobody does it by themselves.
Right.
So there's a truth in imposter syndrome sometimes that you want to inspect, meaning you might be outside your depth or scope, or you might be trying to lone wolf something, in which case you literally are not enough, meaning your efforts aren't enough, not your like value, right? But like you're not enough to get to 7 figures by yourself. I've never met someone who's done that. Like they've had at least a VA, right? Like not by themselves. So when it comes to a different type of imposter syndrome, which is like maybe you've gone through life and experienced challenges, or you have education or whatever, and you're still feeling you're not enough, that focus is a little bit different because now you're focused on performance, you're focused on what other people will think, and it's the wrong focus because now the focus is on you. But like on this podcast, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about how I can help you and how I can serve people listening. When I'm speaking from stage or helping people in any way, I have an external focus. I kind of forget myself in a lot of ways. And that's so helpful because I'm really thinking about the people that I'm serving. And I think that when you have imposter syndrome and it's not the I'm doing it by myself type where that's valid, or I'm outside my scope, which is valid. But if you have imposter syndrome where it's just thinking about yourself, you're focused on the wrong thing, which is yourself. And you want to try the best you can to focus on other people and serving them and have a balance so that you're not selflessly giving and running out of steam all the time. But certainly those moments of courage to realize this is not about you. This is about something larger than you.
Wow. Yeah, it seems like making that shift from like focusing on the internal about yourself versus the external.
Yes.
And it seems like that fear or that imposter syndrome, regardless of where you're at in your life, isn't going to go away.
Well, it's developmental. I mean, it comes from our history, right? So like when we're children, our self-worth comes from how responsive our parents were. And there's research, Beatrice Beebe at a Columbia University does these like research on like these like 1/100th of a second moments of like facial expression between like a mom and a kid, like infant, like these moments. How attuned the face of the mother is will either regulate or dysregulate the child. And the first 3 months, if there's attunement, you're basically set up for life. If there's misattunement, now we're going to start to see other problems potentially start to emerge. And then within the first year, you're kind of on a trajectory. Now you can change that, but there's sort of a developmental trajectory. So what that means is how available our caregivers were when we were younger equates to our own self-worth.
Wow.
Because when we're children, we're egocentric. We're only thinking about ourselves. So if mom or dad is not available, something must be wrong with me. So that's where it begins. So as you go out into the world and you start to express yourself, you're going to run into those things from childhood that get worked out. And certainly in business, there are many paths of self-actualization and therapy and healing. Relationship is one and business is one for sure. And so whatever's coming up for you, it's probably because on some level, a younger part of you is holding, well, when I was X years old, I tried to express myself and nobody was there. And I decided I'm not enough. And so here I am trying to express myself again, but now I'm 35 or 36 or 50 or whatever. And that same thing is there because that was programming from way back then. And we want to update that programming and recognize also we can't usually delete it, but we can become friends with it and have compassion for it and make it not in the driver's seat. We can put it in the passenger seat. But it's something that for me, every time I level up, I have these young parts that just are always there. Like they're always there. But now it's just like a playbook. I'm like, here we are. This one part, little guy, he thinks no one's going to show up because he was in this incubator for the first 3 days of his life. So no matter what I do, he's like, if I do a seminar, he thinks it's going to be an incubator seminar. No one's going to be there. Or if I'm going to be on a podcast, maybe Doug won't be there when I get there. Like there's this little tiny part. And I'm like, love you, bro. But he's not the CEO of my business.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? He's like over here in the passenger seat.
Yeah. So what would you say to someone? So obviously we run subconscious patterns. And a lot of times they create a lot of disruption in our life.
Yes.
And we get to a point where like, okay, this isn't working. And then we'll look into the healing path. And I did this for myself. I looked into the healing path and it's incredibly overwhelming, right?
Yes.
There's so many different modalities and so many different people talking on social media, and everyone's talking about trauma and healing, and it feels really overwhelming. And it's a lot of people are like, I don't even know where to start. My current life isn't going the way I think that it should. I'm running into these patterns. I'm ruining, relationships and my career trajectory and friendships. And this whole healing thing, for some people, it can be a big turnoff because you get these really, really woo-woo people, and then you get the really intense trauma stuff. And it's just a really confusing, overwhelming path. And a lot of people talk about it. So what would you say, like, how can someone start into this healing path, right? And I love your book. It's all about the nervous system.
Yes.
Because that's really what we want, is we just want to be regulated.
Yes.
We just want to feel okay.
Yes.
So what are some what advice would you give to someone where it's like, okay, I need to make a change. I'm incredibly overwhelmed. How can we make this process more approachable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm about to give some advice that nobody's going to want to hear, probably, especially if you're ambitious or have big goals. But this is like your big brother talking to you, being like, yo, kid, you don't know the ropes. And like, actually, this is what's going to get you to your dreams. So the context of what I'm going to share with you is this is the actual thing that will get you to the next level. And it's not what you're going to want to hear, which is we need to slow down and we need to pay attention to what's happening in our body. And believe it or not, we want to actually become friendly with the parts of us that are procrastinating, overwhelmed, fed up, want to go faster and can't, feeling helpless. I can feel all the achievers like, no, I got to change my mindset, Mastin. No, because that approach is why you're here in the first place. And I remember one time I had my therapist who's genius. I was like in this moment of righteousness. And if I get righteous in therapy, you're on a pattern with me, because it's like I start to get like, I know better than you. And that's like one of my like last strung defense systems. It's like when I start to get that way, it's like, okay, we're on something. And I remember my therapist being like, it's important for you to slow down. And I was like, why the F would I do that? It makes no effing sense. I start cussing like this lovely, amazing human, right? And I was like, why the F would I slow down? There's nothing good about it. What's good about slowing down? And she said, now you're asking good questions. And I was like, like I was like cornered, which is why she's my therapist, because it's hard to corner me. And I started to realize, like, if I slow down, there's this body that I've been ignoring and these emotions that I've been ignoring. And the people around me are not like always like the kindest or whatever it might be. So there's like so much I'm not paying attention to, and it would manifest in physical symptoms. So if you don't do it, your body will do it for you. You'll have to slow, you'll have an injury, something, chronic illness, something will happen, and you'll have to slow down. But slowing down, if you think about like driving a car, if I'm going 5 miles an hour and I have a quick turn, there's not that much damage. But if I'm going 250 miles an hour and just a quick little jolt, you're going to like tumble. And so if you're trying to go quickly and you can't like actually maneuver, you're kind of frozen, like one little problem will like ruin your life. But if we slow it down, we go, hold on a second, what's happening inside my system? And we live in a world where, the sort of titans of industry, and someone who I consider to be very intelligent, Elon Musk, like has publicly stated there's no value in him talking about what happened between him and his father. Now, this is crazy to me, because if we understand that the sort of first principles of our life is we experience life through our nervous system, that would be like Elon Musk saying there's no value in understanding the laws of physics, because physics are the first principles of how the universe works. And he spent a lot of time focused on the first principles of physics and taking a systems approach to building all these incredible companies. But his lack of awareness around his nervous system, the trauma that he holds, the overwhelming experiences that he's been through. What is it with these billionaires that their goal is to leave the earth? Like, what's so bad about being here? Right. And like, it's like we have to have more education around this, because nobody wants to slow down. We would rather go to Mars than to feel our feelings. Like that's pretty like staggering if you think about it. And also from a purely scientific understanding, if you talk about someone who's like so focused on physics, first principle systems thinking, it's stupid, because we need to understand our nervous system. We need to understand what we're holding, how we're holding it, how it got that way, and then can we create corrective emotional experiences? And so until we have people who are the highest achievers in the world that people look to for business success, aspirational success, to say, hey, we need to befriend our nervous system, we're kind of screwed. And I personally think we should have a net zero trauma rule, which means we should not be spreading human suffering to other planets. So there should be like some type of trauma assessment that someone should go through before they go to the moon or to Mars or to wherever we're going, before we start spreading out human nervous systems on different planets. We have to make sure that we're okay with our own internal system first. And so for me, it's about slowing down and befriending the parts of ourselves, the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings, the physical sensations that were inadmissible when we were younger, that our parents couldn't love, our parents couldn't pay attention to, and to bring them into our consciousness. John Bowlby, who's the founder of attachment theory, has a quote, which I'll paraphrase. He says, that which cannot be expressed to the mother cannot be expressed to the self. That could be your caregiver, it could be your father, it could be your grandfather, whoever your caregiver was. Whatever you were not able to express to them, we delete towards ourselves. And we want to bring that conscious. And that's not fun. It's like, this is like, I feel like it's kind of like emotional. I don't know if you know Lane Norton, BioLane, but like, he's basically like all these people trying to biohack their way into like the body they want and losing weight and all this type of stuff when we're just trying to avoid hard work. And so this is like the same idea. There's emotional fitness, and part of emotional fitness is cuddling up to depression, sadness, anxiety, stress, fear, etc., and becoming friends with those parts of you rather than trying to get rid of them, because it's just a futile effort. It's like trying to cut your foot off. Like you could probably do that, but then you're going to you'll be disabled in a way that wouldn't make any sense. And so I think it's a very important thing to have a befriending attitude towards the parts of you that you don't want to pay attention to. And the only way to do that is to slow down. And it can feel like a lack of progress. It can feel like I'm following this guy's advice and I felt better before, but now I feel like shit. But it's like, no, you already felt like shit. You just didn't know it. And so we're slowing down enough to be able to process those things and then make what's called a re-decision about what things mean. But if you don't slow down, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And I love that point you said about you don't realize how shitty you feel. And I remember when I first took my healing seriously and had some massive breakthroughs and moved through some really big patterns, I had such an aha moment of like, oh my gosh, I was so used to feeling anxious that I just thought that was how life was.
Yes.
And I wasn't even aware of how wrapped up I was. And it reminds me too, I remember, I'll never forget, it was 2017 and I was finally like gonna take healing seriously. And I remember I sat down with my first coach. Her name's Kristen Ulmer. She wrote The Art of Fear. I don't know if you know Kristen. And she goes, tell me about your childhood trauma. And I'm like, trauma? I didn't have any trauma.
Yeah.
Right? Because a common misconception a lot of people have is, when we hear trauma, you think of something incredibly intense.
Yes.
Right? My uncle took me into the closet and molested me when I was a little kid, or there was a serious car accident. I severed, a limb. And so a lot of people, at least I did, would discredit trauma because it didn't have this massively, intense experience. And so I'm curious, how do you define, because trauma is what's dysregulating our nervous system.
Yes.
Right? At the end of the day.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I'm trying to make sense. So I'm curious, how do you define trauma that creates dysregulation?
Yeah. It's a great question. So a little bit of context. Okay. So this is such a new conversation. At the end of World War II, the government's stance on soldiers who are coming back from World War II, which is like the bloodiest thing we've seen in terms of like hand-to-hand combat ever. Like we've never seen anything like it since. There's been lots of war since, lots of war before. We never saw Normandy Beach before. We never saw the Battle of the Bulge before. Like these things are like super, like what happened in World War II globally was intense for everybody. And like one of the main generals in the US military, General Patton, would like blame soldiers for not being strong enough. The term was shell shocked, and there was a shame carried around with like, I'm shell shocked. Like I must not be strong enough. And then into Korean War and into the Vietnam War, we start to realize that there's this like thing called PTSD. Basically, it starts to emerge in the data and the research. And then that gets codified in the 80s, 90s, and recently. And so now we understand like that war has a certain impact on people. So like that's a relatively new discovery in the field of humanity, basically. Because before that, we didn't really have a term for it. We didn't have a language for it. And now we have words like trauma, like the original word trauma in Greek means wound. But like, what does that exactly mean? Because if I'm training and I want to get stronger, I have to create micro trauma. That's what working out is. You create micro traumas in your body to heal. But there are these big sort of like ruptures that can kind of happen. And the big is not how they look or how other people experience it. The big is in your system. So there's this idea of big T, little t trauma, which I don't believe in. Everybody has big T trauma in experience. Whether the outside seems more or less dramatic, the felt sense is intense for the person. But the way that I think about trauma is it's basically any experience of threat, disconnection, isolation, or immobilization that will dysregulate the optimal functioning of your nervous system, endocrine system, immune system, cardiovascular system, metabolism, spirit, soul, etc. So if you have like this, like not momentary, but long-term immune system dysregulation or emotional dysregulation or, endocrine hormone dysregulation, physical dysregulation, any of that stuff basically is a trauma. And it's not obvious sometimes, because if you have like, if I get like cut on my arm, you can see the scar, you can see the blood, like it's obvious, but emotional trauma is sort of invisible. I mean, there's facial expressions and tonality that starts to happen and change, but for the most part, it's like not so obvious. And also, trauma can be neglect. It could be what happened to you or what didn't happen to you. Trauma could be a divorce. It could be loss of the assumptive world, where you thought there was a God of a certain type and then something awful happens. How could God like this make something like that happen? There's so many different types of trauma, but it's all about how it impacts the individual. So it's not about necessarily the thing. It's how did that thing impact me? And then who was there for me during and after? Well, before, during, and after. So somebody can go through the exact same experience, but one person, their experience was pushed under the rug, versus someone else was believed. It's more traumatizing and worse to have your experience discredited, discounted, and not believed than it is to be welcomed back into a community. And so we can go through almost anything when we have the people we love most, and they believe us. So there's lots of different nuance in this, but basically, if you have stress, if you have depression or sadness, if you have grief, if like you can't ever get still, if you have a hard time sleeping, if you have a hard time paying attention, there's something there. We could call it, my friend Frank Anderson says, an overwhelming experience. It's still trauma. It's just semantics to reach a population of people who don't want to acknowledge they're wounded because it feels like they're weak. But like that's like an old school mindset that like was adopted from World War II and before that we haven't quite updated yet. Like it's actually, it makes you a stronger person to acknowledge when you're hurt. It makes you more trustworthy in relationship to acknowledge that. So, but it's still a relatively new term, and it kind of gets thrown around. But it's really about the long-term impact in your system, and it can manifest in so many different ways. So there isn't just like one type of trauma. And the other problem is, if you look at the different definitions, no matter where you go to DSM-5, you can go to the IDC, you can go to IDC-11, you can go to Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, Bruce Perry, SAMHSA, go down, Peter Levine, go down the list, they're gonna have a different definition, right? If you go to Oxford English Dictionary or Webster's Dictionary, different definition. So we don't even really have a term that's defined yet. If you go to the DSM, where a lot of these diagnoses come from, trauma isn't even a diagnosis. There's just post-traumatic stress disorder with this very random definition of trauma. So like we still haven't quite mutually agreed upon what does this word even mean, and we're all using it so much also. So that's why in Reclaim Your Nervous System, I present a unified definition based on the neuroscience to say, this is what I think it is. And you can take it or leave it, but this is when I say trauma, this is what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, very, very beautifully said there, brother. And one thing, especially when I work with a lot of men who are kind of new into the healing space on my coaching business. And the way I've defined it is, there's more to it, but in a simple way to kind of really bring it down is trauma is any experience you've had in your life where due to the impact of that experience, you now believed you are less than, I don't belong. There was a disconnection from as simple as being a simple tease when you were in second grade on the elementary school playground. But any moment that it created a story that I'm not enough.
Yes.
I don't belong. I don't fit in. Therefore, my behavior or my mindset or my internal experience is now changed, or I've withdrawn from the situation. And
that's an important distinction, because you could have a moment where that story is created, but if it gets repaired, then it's not really a trauma.
Right.
It's more like a rupture, right? It's the things that go unrepaired long term that our nervous system trait become a state over time, where it becomes a new baseline. So that's the thing, is that it has long-term effects. And the thing is, we don't even have a full brain developed until we're 25. So we don't even know all this stuff's happening when we're younger. So it's like the first 25 years is kind of like anyone's guess. And then at 25, usually 25 to 30, around 30, people are like, maybe it wasn't like how I thought it was. Maybe why is this relationship thing not working out, or this business thing quite work out, or I got the money, but I'm not happy, or whatever it is. And then we start to do more introspection, and we start to look at the first 25 years and go, oh my God, that wasn't what I thought it was. And I think that that's normal because we have the anatomy to be able to do that. But I think it's important to understand that we have experiences that are left unrepaired. And we just, to your point earlier, think it becomes normal. But we can repair them, usually through safe relationships. But yeah, I think the important distinction is you can have an acute moment, but that's like going to make you stronger. If it's unrepaired, it's not going to make you stronger. Yeah. It's gonna cause you to have a lot more pain than you need.
Yeah, and switching extremes now, right? So, it's hard to get on the healing train, right, for a lot of people because there's a lot of misconception or it feels daunting. And then you eventually, a lot of people, as we talked about, will have the courage to finally get on the train. And then we live here in LA where it's very glorified. Like, everyone's an influencer, everyone's, has a healing Instagram page and yada, 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 whatnot. How do you get off of it, right? Like, when does it end? A lot of times people I see a lot of people fall into these patterns of like, I got to do the next ceremony, I got to do the next healing thing, and I got to do the next thing. And that in a way is almost disrupting their life as well, because they're missing out in their life thinking that I'm not fully healed, therefore I'm not worthy. And if I just keep doing the healing, then finally one day I'll be fully fixed and then I'll be worthy of the life I desire.
Yeah. If they're operating like that, then they haven't healed.
Exactly. Right.
So I like to contextualize everything with a purpose. So it's like that's where I start. Why am I doing this? Why am I going to go do somatic work? Why am I going to go do psychedelics? Why do I want to go get a functional life coach? Or like, what's the why behind it? And also, we have to understand what's the why. If we don't have a why, then it's a shit show, basically, with no direction. So that would be my first question. The other thing is to understand, like, what does it mean to be healing? Like, if you look at all the psychedelic research that's emerging, which is profound out of the MAPS organization, whether it's MDMA therapy, which is about to be FDA approved, hopefully in August, very excited about that. That'll be amazing. Ketamine therapy that is approved, ayahuasca, psilocybin, all the different things that are emerging. There's also these distinctions being made with these different psychedelics in terms of what they do. They're very different. But if you look at the actual, like what MAPS is doing, here's what they say. What is creating change is the therapeutic alliance, meaning the relationship between the therapist and the client. That's the agent of change. This thing, MDMA, accelerates the efficacy, or if something works, it makes the therapeutic relationship work better. It makes this dyadic between two people situation improve its outcomes. But what it's not saying is MDMA is this magic bullet. We're not saying that. We're not saying that ketamine is a magic bullet. We're not saying that ayahuasca is a magic bullet. So if you're thinking that, oh, I'm going to go to Peru and be with a shaman and do ayahuasca, well, that's a beautiful thing to think. But if you think that that is the work, you're missing the point. The whole point of, if you look at the MAPS protocols on MDMA, for example, there's like a whole bunch of like prep to get you ready. Then you have your experience, and there's about 3 months in between of integration before your next experience. And there's another 3 months. So you do that 2 or 3 times in the MAPS protocol. And so the focus is on the therapeutic alliance, the safety between practitioner and the client, and integration. And so if you're in that pattern, you're more in this like magic bullet mindset where it's like the ayahuasca will do it, or the ketamine will do it, or the breath work will do it, or maybe it's the cold plunge. No, it's actually contrast therapy. No, it's actually just the infrared sauna. Actually, no, it's probably this green juice. Like, you're in a magic bullet mindset versus an integration mindset. And that's a part of, we need to slow down and go, who in there thinks that one more thing is going to help you? Because that's the part we want to work on. And so I also want to say that I don't know if the healing journey ever ends. And what I mean by that is I take my cues from performance-oriented people who do great things. So Tom Brady, love him or hate him, like, if you look at how he was until 45 in the NFL, well, he was taking a hit all the time. So he was always having to heal. But the way he trains that he could take a hit but not be taken out. And he's always trying to level up the next level. So if you're ambitious, you're going to be causing stress on your body. The clinical term for that is allostatic load, which is stress over time. So we need to be recovering, which is healing, but with a purpose. Like Tom Brady's purpose was to win Super Bowls, right? Maybe your purpose is to grow your business, or to be a father, or to make some amount of money, or whatever that is. But if you're healing towards a goal, if you're focused on integration, not magic bullets, then I don't think it ever ends. But the kind of craziness that you're describing is magic bullet thinking, not integration focus. And so to me, that's not the target. The target is integration and actually like getting behavior change and using these tools to help us make behavioral changes and like give us this neuroplastic experience in our body to have the less stress to be able to actually make the change.
Yeah, and it reminds me, I'll never forget, one of my first ayahuasca ceremonies, right? Before you do is something that big, you're all fired up and excited and you're curious and I don't know what this is going to be and you're going to heal and you go and you have that experience, and anyone who's had that experience understands like the magnitude of
Yes.
like, holy shit, like my life will never be the same. And then by the third night, I remember the facilitator was like, all right, everyone, thanks for coming. Now the actual ceremony begins.
Yes.
Once you leave, how do you actually integrate it into your life? And that was profound for me at the time, right? When I first started on that experience.
Yes.
And
So important.
it's so important that actually there is no finish line. Like you never complete the healing. You never make it. You're never fully, healed in that capacity. And it's learning to live your life working with the unhealed patterns and parts of yourself. But on that too, I also believe that you can actually do some serious work to remove some major blockages that drastically improve the quality of your life.
Yes.
And there'll always kind of be some sort of residue.
Because though, here's the thing, because you're ambitious.
Yeah.
If you just are cool with the way things are, then this won't be a problem. But if you have ambition, you're the problem because you're making things harder on yourself.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, if you have ambition, you're going to want more. If you want more, you're going to be causing more stress to yourself. If you cause more stress to yourself, that causes injury. That stress needs to have recovery, just like progressive overload in the gym, or just like becoming a champion on the field of play and performance. So if you just had less ambition, then wouldn't be a problem. So like, I know lots of people, I wish I could be like this, who are just okay with exactly how life is. I'm like, how do you do that? Like, I'm always wanting more. I'm always growing. And I've embraced that about myself. So I plan and have in my lifestyle active recovery, which is another way of saying healing, because I'm constantly adding more stress to myself because I want more. So if you want more, then you're never going to be healed because you're always going to be causing stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it ties right in because, my like mentor in life, who I've only met him twice briefly, but Michael Singer. Right.
Oh,
Untethered Soul.
Love Michael Singer.
Like for me, he's like the GOAT.
Yeah.
Like his work and his teachings for me have been the most impactful of my life. And he always breaks down his teachings to basically what you're saying, in your book, Reclaim Your Nervous System, is all we truly want is to feel okay. We just want to feel relaxed, steady, confident, motivated, inspired. We want to feel at ease, which is another way of, I have a calm nervous system.
Yes.
Right. I want my nervous system to be regulated. And one thing I teach a lot of my clients is this concept of anxious people, or you can swap out that word, anxious, overwhelmed, stressed, right? Anxious people make poor decisions.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
Yes.
Right. And it's what that is our nervous system is dysregulated. And when we are feeling dysregulated, that's very unpleasant.
Yes.
Right? It's not comfortable to feel dysregulated. And so if we're making decisions from that state, right, we're actually out of integrity because we're choosing things that we think will make us feel okay, rather than what's the actual best solution to the opportunity at hand.
Yes, that's so true.
Right. And so I love this book because you see a lot of self-help and healing books that are talking about different somatics and whatnot, and you're just like going straight to the core, right? you want to regulate a nervous system.
Yes. And the thing about that too is if you just look at how we're wired, like we are regulated or dysregulated by how much stress or challenge we feel. So you can think of your nervous system as this like inverted stoplight: green, yellow, red. Green is called ventral, yellow is called sympathetic, red's called dorsal vagal branch. Basically, I'll go into it more in the book, but it's kind of like this inverted stoplight. And depending on how much stress you experience or challenge you experience, we drop down predictably. And what happens if we go from green to yellow, for example? Well, in green, we have our prefrontal cortex, which is our most advanced machinery. That's where good thinking comes from. Literally executive function. If you're a CEO, chief executive officer, you better have executive function going on, right? And what happens though is if we drop into yellow, like a lot of the energy gets diverted away from the prefrontal cortex down into the limbic system and into our extremities, because our body is preparing to fight or flee, which means we don't actually have the neuroanatomy or the capacity to make a good decision because we're in a different state. And if there's too much challenge, we drop down into that dorsal vagal branch, which is immobilization. So Like it literally diverts resources. Our nervous system diverts resources based on how much stress we're experiencing. And so we don't actually have our neuroanatomy available to make a good decision either, because we're too busy reflexing and responding.
It reminds me of that quote from Naval Ravikant. He says, imagine how effective you would be if you didn't feel so stressed all the time.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what are some tips, right? I know you dive into the book, but what are maybe some tools or some techniques of, because a lot of times we are in a high stress situation and we get triggered, right? And like we have to make a quick decision.
Yes.
And we're feeling stressed out, we're feeling panicked, feeling overwhelmed, and we don't have a lot of time to like go take a break and go meditate and go regulate. What are some tools or some techniques or insights that people can use to self-regulate kind of on the spot?
Sure. So again, I'm going to reference Tom Brady again.
Yeah.
So let's pretend that question is a slightly different question. Let's pretend that you're trying to win a Super Bowl, and let's pretend that you're like the star quarterback, and you just ask the star quarterback, what are tips or tools you have for not being tackled? And the answer is like, well, I'm probably gonna get tackled.
Yeah.
Right? At least once, right?
Yeah.
Or sacked many times, right? So what does Tom Brady do? Well, he actually prepares his body ahead of time to be able to be tackled or take a hit or to get sacked and not be injured. So what is he doing? He's hydrating. He's doing all this crazy, amazing pliability work where he'll literally apply, he calls it positive trauma to the body, where he'll be in a position of movement and they'll put positive trauma on the body, meaning like they'll work out a trigger point, but in motion, which is how he'll be on the field. So that when he's hit in motion, the body's used to taking a hit, so it doesn't break. And so what does that mean? Well, most of us have predictable patterns that we get that stress us out. You can rehearse ahead of time, experiencing a trigger and making a different choice, which makes sense to me. So it's almost like a similar thing where it's like, okay, there's these 5 ways to get triggered. When somebody has this facial expression or says this to me, this happens. Every time I try to express myself on Instagram or whatever, this happens. So you can literally rehearse before you're triggered. Okay, I feel myself being triggered. I want to go live on Instagram. I want to post this thing, but I feel this part doesn't want to do that. And I'm going to experience it and I'm going to make a new decision. And I actually can do it ahead of time so that when I actually get into the moment, I already have practiced taking a hit without being taken out. It's a very similar approach. And it's at some point we become so predictable with how we defend ourselves or how these defenses that come up. So if you can rehearse ahead of time being triggered, but making a different choice, that the concept is called implementation intention, basically, where you say, if this happens, then I will do this behavior. It comes out of the work of BJ Fogg. And I think Atomic Habits picked that up also, James Clear's work. But that's all comes from BJ Fogg. If I can rehearse it ahead of time, then when it happens, I'll be ready versus I'm just triggered, because triggers are these reflexes that just happen without your decision. So like they're going to happen. You're not going to ever not be triggered. If something means something a lot to you, or you love something, or you're going for something, you're going to be triggered. Tom Brady was tackled and sacked many times on the way to the Super Bowl. So if you know that's going to happen, then be intelligent about it and plan ahead so that when you get triggered, you can actually rehearse making a different choice before it happens. So that you don't just let this like unconscious reflex that's based on the past run your life, which is not the same as I'm not triggered. I'm fine. That's not what I'm talking about. Right. It's like, no, I've been here before.
Yeah. And the awareness of realizing what your unhealthy patterns are, right?
Yes.
So that you can prep for the situations when that trigger is going to come up, and understanding that pattern that's gonna come, and then making that conscious decision before you're in the experience of the pattern of this is how I'm gonna respond.
It's no different than sports.
Yeah.
It's no different than understanding that there's a certain type of defensive play or offensive play. Or if you're on a basketball team, you're gonna run a certain pattern of offense or defense. Like it's no different. It's just we're on the field of performance is our nervous system versus like the basketball court or the football field or the baseball stadium. And so like it's the same idea though. Like there's no athlete who doesn't rehearse. There's no athlete who doesn't practice, right? There's no athlete who doesn't just put in the hours to get the outcome that they want. The same thing is true when it comes to this type of work. It's like an athletic mindset for training your nervous system to be into what we think of as emotional fitness.
Yeah.
Basically. And but same thing with fitness, like you don't do the work, you don't get the results. Right. So it's like, imagine taking a physical fitness journey, or imagine trying to like be a professional athlete and get this goal with the mindset that I shouldn't be triggered. I shouldn't experience challenge. If I experience a trigger or challenge or injury, it means I'm not doing it right. Patrick Mahomes a couple years ago got injured in the postseason. He didn't say what someone would say in our space. Well, if I get injured, I must not be doing it right. He's like, no, I'm on the field of play. I got injured. So what did I do? I took care of it. I wrapped it. I pushed through and then in the off season, really took care of it for the next season. We have to have the same approach as it relates to emotional fitness. But for some reason, we feel like, well, when it comes to this stuff, there's different rules. But like you would never go into a gym or CrossFit or Barry's Boot Camp or Soul Cycle or whatever you're doing with that mindset that I shouldn't have to push through this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it's also, I think it's expanding your ability to actually, when those triggers happen, that once, you practice this down, you have a game plan. It feels like just having the game plan itself allows the trigger to not be as intense.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Just the act of creating a game plan itself
Big time
will minimize the intensity of the experience when it does trigger.
Yeah. I mean, let's do physical fitness. Let's say you're going to go to the gym, it's chest day, and you want to do a PR, personal record, right? Well, you're probably going to show up fueled. You're not going to show up with like out of gas.
Yeah.
You'll probably have someone there with you because if you're going to do a PR, you might not get it up all the way up, right? Whether it's bench press or whatever. So you're going to have someone there spotting you too. The combination of having a plan and having a person that you can share these things with is super important, like a safe person where you can have a shared context is super important too. But literally, if you just take your training mindset for like the gym, CrossFit, like whatever your thing is, and you adopt it for your emotions, it's the same exact approach, just with these things called emotions, which aren't six-pack abs or muscles, but they guide everything in your life,
Yeah. Yeah. And, switching gears a little bit, one thing I deeply admire about you is your focus and intentionality in your research, right? You've studied some of the brightest minds and most important minds in this topic of healing and trauma and whatnot. And the era we live in, the Instagram world, and everyone's posting about it, and it's kind of this hot topic. I'm actually curious from your perspective, what is actually some bad advice you see
so much
getting posted where you're watching, an Instagram reel and you're like, what in the hell is this person talking about? This is terrible advice.
God, there's so much of it. A lot of, especially in the realm of relationships, like Instagram and TikTok is not where you should be going for relationship advice. When they're like, here's 10 green flags or 10 red flags or this or that. I'm just like, this is like, I cannot believe people are making relationship choices based on this fucking carousel. This is bullshit,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times what we see or what I see on Instagram or TikTok is like, example, if they're not all in, then you should be all out. Like these like kind of like black and white statements. Or this idea that like nervous system regulation means you're going to always be calm. No, nervous system regulation means that you can dysregulate and come back. It means you can experience your full spectrum of emotions and not be taken out by them. Relationships are so complex. There's no such thing as black and white in relationships. And like there's so much bad relationship advice on Instagram and TikTok. And the majority of it is like designed to seem like it's being helpful, but it creates more black and white thinking. And it's also this idea that like I have to love myself enough before I get into a relationship. That's not a thing either. Like if you have relationship trauma, that's getting healed in relationship. But I felt better when I was single. Yeah, because you weren't being triggered. But you're going to be triggered in your next relationship again. So it's like it gets healed in relationship too. So it's like there's so much this idea that everything has to be so either simple, or that everything is because of trauma, or that like if there's this black and white relationship advice out there. And there's also this idea that I think this term narcissism is being thrown around way too much.
Yeah.
And like there's I can't remember her name is. Dr. Ramani wrote a book called It's Not You. And what I like about that book is it's giving people who have experienced abuse words and language to define their experience. However, in the book, she calls for the label of narcissistic personality disorder, which is a diagnosis, to be removed from the DSM, which I think is a bad idea. And she kind of makes up her own definition of what narcissism means. And then we're throwing around this label. And then she'll say, well, you know what? Narcissism is a personality spectrum. It's like, well, no, narcissism is a personality disorder, not a spectrum. And there's a spectrum of everything's a spectrum on some level. But what happens now is Like, am I for people who are in an abusive situation having a label for their situation? Yes. Do I think abuse is good? No. But this like flippant use of the term narcissist, it's like, it's toxic because you have to understand that if you're in a toxic dynamic, you're contributing to it. And this other term, gaslighting, like what does gaslighting mean? Gaslighting is intentionally abusing somebody to make them not believe their reality is their reality. And what do? We disagree with somebody. You're gaslighting me. Oh, you don't want to respect my boundary. You're a narcissist. It's like, well, you changed the rules of the relationship. What do you mean? Like, we didn't even talk about this. How am I a narcissist? So it's like, and it takes away from people who are truly narcissistic and have narcissistic personality disorder. Just like if someone were to experience like sexual abuse, but someone else didn't. If someone didn't experience sexual abuse, but they said they were raped, that discredits every other rape survivor, right? So just flippantly throwing around this term narcissism discredits people who are actually experiencing narcissistic abuse, and it becomes this like phrase. Where like I was literally in a hair salon in Beverly Hills, like, oh my God, he's such a narcissist. He's gaslighting me. And I'm like, I think they're arguing. Like, I don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like,
it deflects responsibility.
Correct.
Right.
Which is different than that person actually has this mental illness that's diagnosable by a psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist from a diagnostic criteria. And also people will say that people who are narcissists can't be healed, but the literature is very clear they can.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of like it's good that we're getting language for people's realities, but we just start accusing people of being these things because we saw it on a TikTok or on an Instagram. And it's like, yo, slow your roll.
Right.
Slow your roll. You know, Mastin, most narcissists won't even go see a psychologist or psychiatrist to be diagnosed. Okay, cool. Well, are you one?
Yeah.
Because if you're not, don't be diagnosing people either.
Right.
Right. But you can definitely talk about your impact and think the way somebody's impacting you, but that takes responsibility. Like, hey, I'm being impacted in this way, in this relationship. And maybe these tools around narcissism and what they mean and these definitions of things can help me make sense of my reality, but let me make sense of my reality and then be in a situation where I don't want to be around certain types of people. But let's not accuse people that disagree with us or who see things differently to be gaslighting or that there's gaslighting narcissists.
Yeah.
Right. Because also it's sort of narcissistic to do that. You know what I'm saying? Like you're just throwing around these labels. You know, I remember one time I was talking to a friend and I was like, so what I heard you say was X, Y, and Z. And they're like, you're gaslighting me. I'm like, I literally just repeated your own reality back to you. What they meant was you're not agreeing with my experience of reality. That's not gaslighting. That's called differentiation. And so I think that there's a lot of like opportunity for people to clarify that like gaslighting doesn't mean that my opinion is going to change. I'm a different person. I'm going to have a different opinion potentially. I can tap into your experience and validate it, but I may not change my mind. And I think people think if you don't agree with me, you're gaslighting me. But then that means that if I'm gaslighting you because I don't agree with you, then where's my reality? And are you gaslighting me? Like, it's a very like interesting conversation to think about versus like, we're all different people, can have different perspectives. And that doesn't mean we're gaslighting each other, that we're narcissists. And I think we just need to chill out on the labels sometimes and just be like more self-reporting how we feel, kind of more nonviolent communication style than like, you're a narcissist. You know, it's just like, okay, like let's breathe and talk about how you're feeling.
And accept that other people have different opinions and different realities and that's okay. And more importantly, like accepting the responsibility that sometimes it's actually, you know, you could have a trigger, and rather than easily deflecting it and pushing out responsibility onto someone else with that label, I think is an important aspect there. I want to go back and touch on something though you said about relationships. And I know you're in a relationship. And I always tell a lot of my clients, I'm like, hey, you think you're healed? Go get into a relationship, right? and your deeper triggers will come out. I'm curious how that's been for you, because I remember when I met you, you were single, right? We talked about dating. You know, we met 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
And we were talking about our dating. Now we're both in relationships. We have both amazing partners. I'm curious the evolution of your healing process has been in regards to being in relationship, because you kind of have your personal healing and they have their personal healing, and then you have healing together within relationship. Seems like.
I think that relationships in general, I mean, how should I put this? There are 3 things in a relationship. There's you, them, and the relationship. And I think that one of the biggest things that I see is people are focused on like being chosen, or people are focused on being wanted, or people are focused on being a priority. Those are things I want, by the way, right? And also, I can evaluate somebody and go, this person is amazing. Like that person is amazing, right? Which is different than what's this relationship like? And are you choosing the relationship? Are you choosing the person or the relationship? Because if you can objectively look at someone who's amazing, okay, that's great. But how are they in this dynamic, right? And that might be a very different experience, right? And so also, if you're focused on being chosen or being a priority, I'm an only child. I need to be the center of the universe. Like, it's like very hard for me if I'm not, right? Which I work on so much, right? I'm like, what do you mean there's other people? Like, no, it's all me, you know? There's a little part of me called Little Pei. He's like a little emperor. And like, what I can say is that like, I shouldn't be a priority. Somebody else shouldn't be a priority. The relationship should be the priority. Does that make sense? And so it's not about picking someone or choosing someone or being a priority or not. It's the relationship. It's choosing the relationship. It's choosing to prioritize the relationship. And I think that that's such an important thing to understand, because if we make it about picking the other person, where did you go? You're gone. You're out of there, right? I'm just going to choose you. Well, then I won't choose me. And vice versa. I don't want to be with someone who chooses me. Does that make sense? Because then they disappear.
Right.
And I don't want to be with someone that I have to choose, because then I disappear. I want to be in a situation where we're choosing the relationship. And I think that that's something that's relatively new in my awareness, because, you know, I'm so focused. Earlier in the conversation, I talked about this, get outside yourself and serve. Well, I can also leave myself behind a lot. And so creating this symmetry where there's like kind of like, and not an imbalance, but there's like this level balance, I think is so important as an intention. And I think also in relationship, you have to start with what's our shared vision and purpose? Like, why are we doing this? And also, how are we going to make agreements? And I think that stuff is really hard to sort out. And it usually gets sorted out in reverse. So you go through something and then you're like, oh, that didn't turn out so well. Let's reverse engineer what just happened and make a new decision about how we're going to govern this relationship. And I also think that in a relationship, it's a two nervous system experience. You can't orient the relationship around just one person's nervous system. So if one person is conflict avoidant and another person isn't, well, you can't orient the whole relationship around avoiding conflict. You also can't orient the relationship around always being in conflict, right? So it's like you have to be able to take the consideration for both people into account. And I think that a relationship being a two nervous system perspective is a very important thing. And if you think nervous system regulation is hard on your own, just throw in somebody else's nervous system, and now you're just like, what do I do? Because it's like they respond the opposite to how you would respond, or whatever it might be. And I think that's what grows us.
Yeah, and I got some really, I just recently my girlfriend and I, Paris and I, got into couples therapy, and
that was fast.
Yeah,
wow.
We want to get in it. We want to get ahead of it.
Okay, love that.
And our therapist said something really, really profound to us last call, and she said, because we talked about dysregulated nervous systems. It's like, okay, how do you move through some of these trials or these big issues when you have two basically different nervous systems? And she says something that's really profound. She says, we always move at the pace of the most sensitive nervous system. Right. And
ideally, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Ideally.
Because you don't want to push someone into something. You want to move at the pace. And so there's situations in our relationship where I have to slow down. Right. And there's situations.
Hard to imagine that.
Right. And then there's situations where she has to slow down. And it's been really, really profound for us. And tagging on to what you said as well, one thing that was an aha moment that you also said in therapy was, my therapist says, hey, I'm here to support you, Doug. I'm here to support Paris, but my main goal is I'm focused on the relationship.
Yes.
Right. I'm concerned about the relationship, which includes both of you.
Yes.
Right. You might be amazing by yourself. You might be amazing by yourself. But the goal here is the relationship is both of you together. But it's kind of like, how do you blend your two nervous systems and ideas and concepts? And so you mentioned, you said you have agreements with your partner.
Yes.
Right.
Ideally. Yes.
Ideally, right. Agreements and goals and whatnot. What would be an example of like what an agreement would look like to best serve, a relationship?
Well, so how should I put this? I have no judgments around what people choose in their relationships. Like you could be in a monogamous relationship. You could be in ethical non-monogamy, like whatever your thing is, like that's for the individuals to decide. However, you get to make the relationship the way you want it, not based on what you used to have. And so usually when we think about agreements, there's going to be different types of agreements, but you just think about how the relationship is going to be governed, right? So what are the major relationship decisions that you're going to be making together? So for example, you could decide, first of all, what's your shared purpose? Like, why are we in a relationship in the first place, right? So if you don't have that figured out, like, hopefully it's more than just like procreation, right? Or like novelty. There's like some larger purpose. So having that, and then what are we creating here? Like, what are we going towards? I think then if you have those two things, then you can start to figure out, okay, so when we hit certain roadblocks, for example, like I'm an only child, right? So I'm highly sensitive to being jealous, right? So it's like, how do we navigate third parties? And how does that work? There can be different agreements there. Or it could be like, how do we handle money together? There could be agreements there. And usually you go through something, people get triggered, and then you reflect, and then you come up with an agreement. So you're not going to like hyper vigilantly create agreements ahead of time. Oh, we got all these agreements figured out ahead of time. No, and agreements should not be made to be punitive either. They should be for the mutual benefit of both people. And in an agreement, both parties should be able to explain why it's good for them and why it's good for the other person. If you can't explain why it's good for you, it's a non-starter. And if you can't explain why it's good for the other person, it's a non-starter. So the agreements have to be both self-serving and serving the other person. And the reason why is because when the shit hits the fan, which it always does, if your agreements are not self-serving, you'll default right out of them also.
Yeah. It goes back to this whole football analogy, really. It seems like you're just watching film, right?
Yeah.
You go in the film room, right? You're recapping the game. You're like, oh, look at this. This happened. Quarterback got sacked. Was there a mistake made, in the strategy? Now, how do we take that in, reassess, and then moving forward, can we have an agreement?
Exactly.
Right.
Here's one that's probably universal. Let's agree to never put the relationship on the line when we're arguing. Like that's like a non-starter for most people. It sends such signals of danger that at that point you're just kind of like, what are you doing? It just makes everything else, like you're not going to accomplish anything in that context. So that would be really nice. Now you could say like, I really feel like telling you that it's over, which is so different than saying it's over. Right. You know what I mean? So like, because it's also kind of like blackmail in a way. If you're always putting the relationship on the line to get what you want, like, I have hypersensitivity to abandonment. So if you threaten the relationship, I'm just like I just go like straight dissociation. Okay, whatever you want, like, and so like, that's something that's very important to me, is like to not put that. But I think that's for most people, like you don't want to go, that's like the jugular, basically. That would probably be a good thing for anyone who's in a relationship to take on.
Yeah. And I can see, one thing I appreciate about my current partner, we've had a disagreement recently. First thing she said is, hey, you're good. I'm not going anywhere. Everything's good here. I'm not leaving. And this really pissed me off.
Yes.
Yada, 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 and yada, yada, yada.
Love that. Great sequence.
Yeah. So leading up to it. And what was nice about it is that it allowed me to stay in the conversation.
Yes.
Because I have a similar pattern where it's like, hey, if you threaten the relationship, I'm going to disassociate.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be engaged. It's going to be like, whoa, I'm losing grip of reality. What's going on?
Yes.
And I then miss the context and the opportunity to learn and grow and expand.
That's right.
Right.
Big
really
time.
Beautiful, man. Mastin, you're amazing.
Oh,
right?
You're amazing.
Thank you, brother.
I'll take it in, but you're also amazing.
I'm so glad we met all those years ago.
Yeah, me too.
Where can people find your book? I mean, this is, I love this. Again, Reclaiming Your Nervous System. I think this is like, you're going straight to the heart of the matter, right?
Yes.
You want to feel regulated.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Well, so Mastin Kipp, Mastin Kipp, Kipp on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, like all the places, mastinkipp.com. And then the book itself can be anywhere books are bought. I recommend Barnes & Noble or Amazon, probably the best bets, but also independent bookstores and stuff like that. But wherever books are sold, you can get it. So that's where it is.
Everyone go give Mastin a follow. I see a lot of my friends reposting this stuff. No one drops better fire on Instagram than you, brother. I really appreciate you coming out, and got a lot of love for you, man.
Thanks for having me, man. It's been awesome. And let me know. Let me send me some of those so I can send those to my friends and tell them how to be too.
I'll send
because they don't share anything.
Send them right over, brother. Appreciate you, man.
Love you, man.
Cool.